Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to be talking about a really impressive leader development program today. But first, a few housekeeping items. We will have time for questions and answers at the end, but feel free to put your questions in the Q&A tool as we go along, and we'll start addressing them when we get to that point in the webinar. Also, there will be a very brief survey, about 4 questions, that pops up at the end of the session. Please take a moment to complete it. It really helps us with the planning and design of these webinars. Also, this program is being recorded for on-demand streaming, so if you like it, you can certainly share it with colleagues later. My name is Jerry Seibert, and I'm an executive consultant with Org Vitality. I have an IO psychology background and have been working in the survey and assessment space since before the internet, and we'll just leave it at that. I have 2 guests with me today to talk about a very impressive case, the leader development program that has been in place at PepsiCo for some time. My first guest is Deb Lee, who joined PepsiCo in 2021 and is currently Senior Director of Culture, Engagement, Assessment, and Development in Global Talent Management. Her role focuses on culture models and initiatives, engagement measurement and programs, and leadership-focused development assessment programs. So she's providing thought leadership to the enterprise in the ongoing design and deployment of PepsiCo's culture, engagement, leadership assessment, and development agenda. And in that capacity, she focuses both on PepsiCo's best-in-class lead program, part of what we'll be talking about today, and core 360-degree feedback tools centered on their Great 5 framework. Deb has over a decade of experience in the IO space, including more than 6 years as an external consultant to government agencies and other clients. She has her doctorate in IO from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, but more importantly, her master's from Western Kentucky University, which is the same place that I went. So go Big Red. My second guest is Bob Lewis. Bob is Chief Assessor for APTmetrics. In this role, he's responsible for the quality of APTmetrics assessment services, including overseeing assessment process and custom simulation development across clients, developing and maintaining the firm's talent pool for delivering assessments. He has been with APTmetrics since 2008, and over his 30-plus years in the field, he has assessed thousands of executives, including several hundred for C-suite roles. In addition, he's consulted with executive teams and boards to help them apply the science of industrial organizational psychology to foster better succession, leader development, and diversity and inclusion practices. Bob earned his master's and doctoral degrees in IO psychology from Rice University, so unfortunately he missed out on Western Kentucky. Deb, Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. I mentioned the LEAD program and called it best in class, and that is not hyperbole. The LEAD program has in fact been recognized repeatedly by outside experts and peers within IO psychology. Its development, validation, and deployment are, I think, an exceptional example of applied IO psychology. And in fact, if that was all PepsiCo did in terms of leader assessment and development, they'd be doing pretty good. But the LEAD program is really just a central element in a much more comprehensive approach to leader development. And here at Org Vitality, we're certainly proud to support their programs with our systems. And working with PepsiCo, we've deployed some global multi-language systems for 360 feedback. They have large cohorts throughout the year that participate across all management levels. It's really a significant volume of 360s. And in fact, they're rolling out right now an extension for individual contributors. There's also what we call a development check-in. When a 360 participant is ready, they can go back to their raters to find out if their development plan has had an impact. Do raters see a change? Do they think the participant should move on to new development areas? And since each 360 participant is working on their own priorities, the development check-in system allows them to tailor the assessment to the specific areas that they've been working on. There's also a lot of 180 feedback. I mean, this is something PepsiCo has been doing for some time, and that we're seeing more and more interest in other organizations, essentially focusing manager feedback outside of the annual employee survey, where there might be some, my immediate manager type questions. And PepsiCo does do an annual employee survey, but they also make sure every manager gets feedback on how well they are managing according to the PepsiCo way. And that keeps it distinct from the annual organizational health survey. And there are a couple more interesting tools that have been deployed in I'd say, more of a supportive role. Recently, we've helped them roll out some on-demand team assessments to help leaders and their teams be more effective. It's an on-demand tool that lets HR deploy an assessment that can be customized for each team within a framework developed by PepsiCo, very rigorously developed. And it can be used by a manager with their direct reports or project leaders with cross-functional teams. And something we call Ping, a very powerful tool that enables highly targeted nudges and reminders to leaders by integrating many disparate systems into one communication engine, I guess you could call it. So for example, you could target a nudge to leaders who got low feedback on recognition in their 360 and or their 180, and who also make below average use of the employee recognition platform, to focus, nudge them to focus more on acknowledging individual efforts and maybe give them a link to a short video on how to give effective feedback in a remote work environment. You can do a lot of really cool things with it. But all in all, I guess the point I want to make is it's quite a commitment to leader assessment and development. But all those awards are not necessarily the highest honor bestowed on the program. PepsiCo's is an approach that has been recognized in a very unique way, and perhaps the most powerful way possible. It's been recognized by the executives and boards of other Fortune 500 companies, in that alumni have been named as the CEO for at least 16 Fortune 500 companies. Now, I had no idea about this until Forbes published an analysis recently. And as impressive as this is, Forbes casually mentioned that there were plenty more outside the Fortune 500 at places like Petco and the Boston Beer Company, where the CEOs also came through PepsiCo's process. So what is this leader development program that has had such a profound impact? Well, I'm going to turn now to Deb Lee. And so Deb, would you please reveal all of the secret formula for for leadership development?
Yeah, I can do that for you, Jerry. So one of the things we wanted to highlight is not just only are we a CEO factory, but we are a head of HR factory. So CHROs, people leaders, head of people, right? All of the different titles that a head of HR can take. This is just a subset of the group that we did kind of narrow it down based off of how big the organization was. But again, just goes to show that the effort that we put into our employees throughout their career, as Jerry said, even right now we're pulling things down to the individual contributor level so that when they're ready to manage, they feel supported and they have the information about themselves to manage in the best productive way. And that continues on, and we'll continue to talk about how we do that, but not just CEOs, but head of HR as well. Next slide, Jerry. All right, so the Great Five is our leadership model. You can see it here to my left. I tend to do this during our lead orientation so I can Vanna White to the different things that we're talking about. But before I was even hired at PepsiCo in 2021, the Great Five leadership model was sent to me. Again, we're just a company that really values the IO scientist practitioner view. And so when I was being interviewed, I got the ability to say, do I agree with what they're doing? Right, they kind of opened up the back curtain, got to see the wizard behind. And it's a pretty good model, right? Even not knowing PepsiCo, if you look at it, it's a pretty easy to understand why it's an effective leadership model. This was put into place in 2020. It really is, again, we think of leadership not as how are you performing now, but how do we get you ready to perform in the future? So it's the foundation for our next generation of future PepsiCo leaders. We do pride ourselves in doing world-class leadership development programs, often starting with LEAD, and I'll walk you through why that is in a minute. But the LEAD program and what we do with our development assessments do inform our talent management process as people are rising through the organization. So it's really talking not just about, again, today's performance, but it's about what do we need to do to help you get ready for the future roles that you want to take on. So it's, in short, reflects what it takes to go from being a good leader to a great leader. Next slide, Jerry. So again, one of the things you're going to hear me say over and over again is it's not about today's performance. It really is about that potential to lead in the future. And how we think about that is very much informed by our former Senior Vice President, Alan Church, who is well published in this area. And this has really been dispersed throughout our leadership at PepsiCo. So it's not just HR, it's not just talent management, but I could go to somebody in marketing and talk about LEAD or talk about the Great Five, and they would have a pretty good understanding that it's about leadership, it's about the potential to lead in the future, and we use that as our guiding post for development. So some of the things we think about when we're talking about who goes into the LEAD process: sustained performance. Have they been sustaining their performance for at least the past couple of years? We always talk about individual expectations when they come out of the process, meaning you're getting feedback on your leadership capabilities, but those need to be put into the context of your goals, of your context, of your job. And then, of course, we have our organization's view on the destination roles. So like I said, the LEAD results are used in talent management decisions. And so understanding where people are today, what they need to develop to get ready for that next role is an important use of the LEAD data. We use this blueprint, and this is one of the ways we talk about the LEAD program, because it is multi-trait, multi-method. And to IOs out there, you kind of go, oh, okay. To our regular general population, this is something that we walk them through so that they understand the robustness of the program. So we talk about fixed characteristics first: personality, cognitive ability. And really what we say is, those are fairly stable over time. We're going to give you a measurement on it for that self-awareness, but know that we really do consider those fairly fixed across time. And, every once in a while, we bring in the example of Phineas Gage because people will ask about different times when personality changes. So again, we really do try to bring this a little bit scientist practitioner view and explain it fully to people. When we think about the growth level, learning agility, motivation, those are definitely important things. Those are not directly measured in the LEAD process, but that career leadership competencies is really where the LEAD process focuses, looking at that foundation and then combining that up with those leadership competencies. The one thing it doesn't do is talk about functional or technical expertise. And so again, that's where we go back to saying those individual expectations, what you are expecting for your life, your career at PepsiCo, makes a difference there. So again, we're just very honest with them about what this program does measure and what context they need to pull into it to make it most meaningful for them. You hit the next button for me, Jerry. And here's really the kind of the crux of this. As Jerry said, if we did this alone, I think that would be great. But the real thing with the assessment-based leadership program here is that we work in conjunction with our learning team. We work in conjunction with our different sectors that are putting on different sector specific. And when I say sector, I mean North America, Europe, Asia, those geographical sectors. To make sure that they're utilizing that data in the best way possible for the people who are going through those more specific programs. So LEAD measures that potential across 4 different assessment tools, which we'll talk through what those are. But really, LEAD is great for self-awareness. It's an individually focused program, but those results get put into so many other programs at PepsiCo that it really just gives the robustness of the program, where you can see it come into play in different areas. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Jerry. So I wanted to give you guys an understanding of the development of this program and where we are today. Like I said, I came in 2021, so I am a caretaker of the program that started back in 2012 with just 32 people. At this point, right, 11 years on, we are getting close to assessing over 20,000 individuals who have been at PepsiCo across our different levels. In 2020, when we updated our leadership model to the Grade 5 leadership model, we also worked with APT to automate the senior director to VP, and you'll see that as L10 to LG1. Those are our leadership levels. But that senior director to manager to director level, I am used to talking in those LG terms. It's hard to switch that off in your head. You can see that uptick when we brought in that automation, and we're able to get those reports to more people faster. If you're looking at that senior director VP level and the SVP level, the one thing to know there is it's fewer people, but every single report there is custom written by someone at APT. All of that feedback is delivered by an individual, whether inside of PepsiCo or at APT. We work in conjunction together to debrief them on their data. So when you're looking at that lower level, you are looking at a more automated process. When you're coming to that senior director and above level, you are looking at a much more white glove process. Next slide, Jerry. So when we think about LEAD, this is what we say to our participants, this is what we say to managers who are supporting participants, and this is what we say to our leadership. It really just answers two questions, right? There's more to the picture here, but it answers two really important questions. What is the leadership potential of our talent? Where can they go? And more importantly, how do we get them there? So where do we focus our development efforts in the future? Next slide, please. All right, so this is our design principle slide. This is the one that we were able to talk through kind of our, again, more scientist practitioner view. It is our holistic approach to how we assess and develop our talent. And as you could see there, we break it up into different levels. Different levels need different things. They have different views of the organization. So we try to be responsive to those different levels. But it is a true multi-trait, right? We have 5 different big dimensions. Underneath that, there is 14 sub-dimensions. We measure against all 14 of those using 4 different assessments. That goes back to that leadership blueprint. It is aligned to our Grade 5. So all of the feedback that we're giving to our participants comes through the Grade 5 model. So they don't have to make any mapping decisions by themselves. It's all aligned to the Grade 5 model. And overall summary scores are inclusive of strength, proficiency, or opportunity ratings. So we use pretty sophisticated algorithms to get where we need to go based off of research, and then based off of course, validation data. We really do target all of these assessments to different levels. And again, we'll show you what that is, right? We are going to give you some secrets today. We'll show you what those are. But again, if you look at this, you see that LG1 and below, that's at that director level where we automated things. And there we're really talking about identifying our future talent and making sure that we are accelerating their development so that as they move in the organization, they've gotten the development they need to be successful at that next level. And we know what they need to be successful at that next level. When we get up to senior directors, we really are talking about refining. Typically at this point, most people have gone through LEAD at the lower levels. And so they're getting another version of LEAD that's a bit more complicated. is a bit more of that 5,000 or 10,000 foot view compared to the 1,000 foot view they may have had before. So we're trying to stretch them a little bit, even when they're going through the lead process. And again, the emphasis here really is on development. We give them a ton of data. We talk about self-awareness, but then we talk about its individual development. We're not going to tell you what you have to do. We also encourage them to think about developing their strengths, right? So it's not always just about the development opportunities. It is about strengths that you want to leverage and you want to carry through different groups of people, different situations. And so that really is the emphasis that we put, is that this is for your development. It is not something that is stagnant over time. We would expect as you develop to go through more lead cycles, to get more assessments, and to get better self-awareness, again, as you continue to develop those leadership capabilities. And one of the favorite things that we say here at PepsiCo is what got you here may not get you there, which is one of the reasons why we assess at different levels and make sure that as people are progressing through, we're able to support them in the best way possible for them to achieve their goals and for PepsiCo to get the benefits of them achieving their goals. All right, Jerry, can I get the next slide, please? Like I said, you're getting some details here. So again, that L9 and below, you guys are getting our leadership levels here. L9 and below is an associate manager and below. Now, of course, everybody at different organizations, how we think of individuals and how we think of titles changes. So for PepsiCo, an associate manager may or may not have direct reports. At that L10 to L11 level, that's managers and senior managers, typically do have direct reports. LG1 is a director, that's our first level of executive at PepsiCo. Again, typically have direct reports, but as they're that first level of executive, we have isolated them alone, and we do put some decent development efforts in to our directors who we anticipate will become senior directors, VPs, and so on. The LG2s and 3s are senior directors, and the LG4s and 5s are VPs at PepsiCo. So if we look across, you can see at the lower levels, we're using the occupational personality questionnaire, right? Some of that decision-making it's a little bit quicker to get through than the Hogan. And there's some monetary costs there that we have taken into account. At that higher level, where people are getting that more white glove, they're able to get all of their data debriefed to them. They're not having to digest it themselves. We have the Hogan Personality Full Suite. Okay. For the cognitive ability, we're using your standard Ravens for that lower level, and then the advanced where it's got a time limit on it. We do the Ravens because this is a global program, and so we did not want a language-based cognitive ability test there. So this is a pattern-based test, right? Just a little bit better when you're talking about working across these different cultures. For current behavior, we do a 360 for those upper levels. And like we talked about a little bit before, we do divvy those out so that the lower levels have that 1,000 foot view. As you get higher, you're going to that 5,000 foot view. Biodata we use for our associate managers and below, again, because most of them don't have direct reports, and it's a very good predictor of potential, right? When we do our validation studies, it's a nice predictor of potential. And then the thing about lead that I always thought was kind of the crux here is the future focused application. So when we ask individuals to go through either the situational judgment test or the simulations, those are designed to represent situations that somebody at a higher level in the organization would typically have to address. So it's not actually pushing them at their current level. It's saying if you were 2 levels up from where you are today, and these are the typical things that you're having to deal with, how would you respond? And so how we explain that to our participants is this is your stretch, right? This is what we're trying to get after, a little bit more of that potential there. So when we look at current behaviors, this is how you're showing up day to day, probably for the last 6 months, maybe 9 months. But that future focus is really, how are you dealing with situations that you likely haven't had to deal with yet? And where is your leadership capabilities and knowing how to deal with those situations in a way that would be effective at PepsiCo? Okay. And then the 360 feedback. Now, 360 we consider a core tool. So the LEAD program itself is considered an accelerated program, especially when you think about that future focused area. But the 360 feedback, as Jerry said, we put thousands of people through 360 feedback every single year. It is aligned to the Great Five. All of the questions are aligned to the Great Five. All of the data that feeds out of it is aligned to the Great Five. It's a fantastic tool for self-awareness and improving those leadership capabilities, whether it's a part of LEAD or whether they're doing it on their own. Oftentimes we actually find people go through the LEAD process and then they follow up using a 360 in a couple of years to be able to kind of gauge how much they have developed since their LEAD data came out. Similar to the LEAD process, it's leader level scaled. So we do not have a off the shelf for anybody to take it that's consistent. For us, the issue there is every time we report out, when people want information, because we give a ton of data to the business, is having to chunk those things and saying you can't compare across those groups, and having to explain that to our business leaders why that is the case. And then, of course, the fun thing that we do at PepsiCo is the participant gets their report. They get a couple of days to digest it, and then that report is automatically sent to their manager a week after they have it. One of our standards here is a participant always sees their data before anybody else sees it, whether it's their HR, whether it's their manager, whether it's the CEO of the company. We're going to say to them, the person needs to see their data first, which again is just something that allows, I think, us to have that credibility with our participants that this is for their benefit. But for the 360, it is automatically sent to their manager. And then, of course, we have resources to help them decipher how to take the data and how to utilize that data to the best benefit of their direct report. Next slide. So these would be what I would say is like the 5 things to remember about how we do it at PepsiCo. And again, I would just caution to say that it has taken years for our culture to get to a point where this is easily accepted by our business. Performance is a gatekeeper, but it's not an indicator of potential. And that's something that we often have to talk about with managers who are reviewing their direct reports LEAD report. Because they say, but they're great at doing what they're doing. And we have to remind them, we're not measuring their performance. We are measuring their leadership potential. LEAD results are validated to predict future success. Again, goes back to that, it's not current performance. They should be used, and they are used as an input for calibrating potential. So if you thought somebody didn't have potential, you put them through the LEAD process, they come out as doing fantastic. That is often used to update how they're thinking about that employee and their future potential as a leader in the organization. But the big thing there is pinpointing development, and making sure that our development efforts are going to be the most useful for that employee. The other thing I think that does make LEAD powerful is typically LEAD is the first thing that they will do, and then those results are put into multiple different programs. So if a learning team is doing a global program, we will send all of the LEAD results over to them. They will tailor their program based off of those results, and then they will also utilize those results when they're doing feedback and development planning coming out of those programs. So they're used not just in LEAD, they're used across the organization, whether it's in people planning or whether it is in development efforts globally or locally. And while no tool is perfect, right? We all know that. Even a multi-trait, multi-method that pulls everything in and you get these fantastic validity results, it does help us reduce bias. It does help us increase fairness, and it does help us make better bets on who will be the future leaders of the organization. All right, I think Bob or Jerry, you're on mute.
I can
Yep, there we go.
go next to
Thanks, Deb.
advance.
It's a lot of information, but it is it's a complex, comprehensive approach that you're using there. So I really appreciate your sharing some of those details. I think that's very valuable to the folks watching the program. And now, yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who is going to give us a little more on that, and also I think a little deeper look at some data that gives us some insights that go well beyond what that Forbes piece was talking about a while back. So let me hand it over to you and get us to the next slide.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jerry. And before I dive into my slides, I do want to respond to some questions that have come in very quickly. One asks, can people outside PepsiCo participate? And the answer is not in these programs. These are customized to PepsiCo, specific to that culture and their challenges. But I will add that both APTmetrics and Org Vitality do work for other clients as well. So we can talk about building similar programs for you. A great question came in. Do external hires at these upper levels go through similar processes? The answer is yes, that they are tailored for external selection. So they are slimmed down, not quite as in depth. People in external selection situations, particularly at senior levels, would not necessarily want to spend a full day or two taking assessments, unlike the folks who are internal. So we scale them down. But yes, indeed, PepsiCo's anticipated that a long time ago. We have a companion set of programs that are specifically targeted to external hires. Someone asked a question about not timing the Ravens. In both instances, whether we're using the standard Ravens or the advanced, we have gone with the vendor's recommendations and their standard tools. So in those cases, we've just followed the vendor's protocols. And a final question, there are a couple of others that have come in. I'll save some of the others for the end, but what live or virtual system vendor do you use to facilitate your live work simulations? That's APTmetrics. And I'll use that as the segue into discussing in a little more depth PepsiCo's senior executive assessment process. I'll talk very briefly about the structure of the program because it's very similar to what Deb has mentioned, and we'll dive pretty quickly into some data to show the impact and some of the unique findings we get at the senior executive level. PepsiCo's senior executive process has the same components because it's part of LEAD that every other LEAD program does. There is a business case simulation that's delivered online and virtually that assesses behavior tomorrow. It puts the participant, who is generally at a senior vice president level, in the role of a global CEO, and they have to make all the decisions using all the data and the pressures that are typically found in that role. There is a 360, which is of course observations of today. There's an interview, structured behavioral interview that focuses on primarily the recent past. And there's a personality assessment, of course. Jerry, if we can go to the next slide. Even at the senior level, PepsiCo and APT have focused on validating these assessments and making sure that they're returning value to PepsiCo. And because we now have several years of experience with these, we've been able to track how participants have done over time. This was from a presentation that PepsiCo delivered in 2018 that shows the impact of the ratings and the overall assessment process at the senior executive level on performance, both short-term and long-term at PepsiCo. Higher scores perform over a 3-year period much better than lower scores. They are much more likely to be promoted than low scorers. And this is a sample of 108, 160 senior executives. You may have seen from the participation by year slide that Deb showed that for this program, the senior vice president level, we are on average putting 30 to 40 people per year through it. When you think about it, that's a pretty substantial proportion of the senior vice president population, even at a company as large as PepsiCo. And that is one of the unique challenges with doing research at the senior executive level. The numbers get awfully small, particularly as you go up the chain. And that's why we started to focus uniquely on what CEO level, C-suite level, very senior executive performance looks like. Jerry, if we can go to the next slide. With respect to this sample that we just showed, different tools were producing different effects. So what PepsiCo and we found when we looked into this is that the 360 is a strong proxy for performance. And it's also highly related to the influence and the network that executives had built. That makes sense. 360 is based on largely your peers and other stakeholders you work with, plus your direct reports. Their familiarity with your work, it is a proxy for the network you have built and how influential you are. Do they know what you're doing? Do they have the opportunity to observe you? And along the way, are they able to work productively with you? The interview was uniquely predictive of inspirational and charismatic leadership, both as it was rated in the 360 and as it was rated in separate surveys that we used to validate the process. The business case simulation, which is forward-looking, was most closely associated with those who had stronger strategic agility, better strategic thinkers, more innovative thinkers, stronger financial acumen. So each one of the components of this process is delivering valuable information to PepsiCo about the network people have, about their inspirational skills, and about their ability to think through challenging and complex problems. We can go to the next slide, Jerry. I just wanted to show you a little follow-up based on this. So we have recently started to look at these data again. And of this sample, about slightly less than 50% of this group are still at PepsiCo, which is a remarkable retention rate at the senior executive level. Of those 50%, slightly less than 50%, about 42% have remained at the same level. About 43% were promoted one level. So now they are in the EVP or business unit C-suite level. And about 14% were promoted 2 levels, primarily to global C-suite roles, one of whom is now the current CEO. So that's the impact that this program has had. Again, you're seeing higher performers get promoted more and earlier. You're seeing them perform more highly, and that's resulting in a substantial number, 14%, getting moved up. But you'll also see 14% of about half the sample, right? It gets down to literally a handful of people. And that is the difficulty with research here, as I mentioned before. The numbers get very, very small. Nonetheless, the impact is high. Such that, as Jerry mentioned at the beginning of the program, PepsiCo has been recognized as a CEO factory, most recently in a Fortune article that came out last December. They do a nice job of listing all of the organizations that have had PepsiCo as part of their CEO's journey. But the difficulty in looking at that sample, and it was certainly not a scientific sample, is that the background of those folks varies considerably. Right? And I just pulled 2 as an example. One's career involved substantial time with a consulting firm and 10 years at PepsiCo in senior and increasingly demanding roles prior to them taking over as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Another CEO spent their first year out of MBA at PepsiCo as an assistant brand manager and then left. So it's arguable how much impact PepsiCo had on that second CEO's career journey, right? Maybe they got some exposure, but nothing like the first one. So it's very difficult to say something about this sample. Jerry, if we can go to the next slide. So we leveraged the data that we had to pull a stronger sample. We identified 12 people who've been through this senior executive process who've become CEOs. Right? This is necessarily a group that has mostly left PepsiCo, right? There's only one CEO at PepsiCo, right? So the other 11 had to go elsewhere. But all of these folks had been with PepsiCo for a substantial period of time. So we can reasonably say that PepsiCo and the training they had at PepsiCo, the exposure they had at PepsiCo, the experiences they had contributed substantially to their ability to get a CEO role in another organization. Of these 12, 3 are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, again, one of which is PepsiCo. 2 went to the Fortune 501 to 1000, and 7 are CEOs of smaller than Fortune 1000, and quite often much smaller, and I'll characterize those samples later. We will focus primarily on the Fortune 500 versus the smaller than Fortune 1000, just because that gives us a stronger comparison. The 2 in the middle are so different that it's not worth throwing them in, and it just confuses things. But if we look at the Fortune 500 group, we'll compare that against the smaller than Fortune 1000 group. Jerry, if we can go to the next slide. And I just wanted to characterize what these folks look like. So you can see here, of these 7 folks, where they were in PepsiCo, how many levels down from the CEO they were, what their subsequent roles were, because not all of them became CEOs right away. Some had to go through a progression, the size of the company, and whether the industry was the same as PepsiCo, another bottling company, another food company, adjacent, where maybe they may have been went to a vendor to PepsiCo or a similar role, or not adjacent, meaning completely different industry. And you'll see some interesting patterns just in this very small sample. One is, if you're further down in the organization, your pathway to CEO is through usually a couple of different steps, right? You've either gone to another organization in a similar role and moved up from there. To the extent that that's not the case, row 1, this person who went directly to CEO in a non-adjacent industry was also already a C-suite member. He was 1 level down from the CEO. So you're seeing some patterns here, particularly for folks who go to smaller than Fortune 1000 companies to CEO roles, is that it's not direct, right? That they're leveraging their experience. They're going to a much smaller organization in a relatively similar role, maybe taking on broader responsibilities. And then for the most part, leveraging that to move their way into the CEO role. That seems to be the pattern for smaller organization CEOs. We can go to the next slide, Jerry. This contrasts with folks who became CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, right? They were, of course, very senior people to begin with. So they were direct reports to the global CEO. In most cases, they went right into CEO roles or very, very high-level similar roles and quickly moved into the CEO role. For person in row 1, that transition from CCO to CEO was less than a year. That they were essentially brought in to be CEO, but because it was a non-adjacent industry, they were rotated around for about 8 or 9 months and then took over the CEO role. So again, when you're seeing somebody go to a non-adjacent industry, the tendency is for them to take on a similar role, but not CEO to the one they had at PepsiCo in order to gain familiarity with the organization. Jerry, if we can go to the next slide. What we wanted to look at next, because we have assessment data on all these folks, are the characteristics that distinguish the Fortune 500 CEOs from the smaller organization CEOs. And we found very similar differences because all these folks are high performing to begin with, right? You don't get recruited to go be a CEO outside PepsiCo if you're not very strong, and you don't become a C-suite member at PepsiCo if you're not very strong. So the 360 doesn't really differentiate because it's mostly about performance, as we noted before. These folks are all high performers. So it's not that a 360 is not helpful in the high potential identification and development process. It's absolutely crucial. My point here is that once you're at that CEO role or being considered for a CEO role, you're a high performer. You're already there. That's Deb's comment, that performance is a gateway to potential. What differentiates people now at this level are the interview, the simulation, and the personality assessments. And in the next couple slides, I'll illustrate very quickly some of those differences. These are very simple results. Again, we're comparing 7 people to 3 people. So there's not a lot of complicated statistics here, but I just wanted to give you a glimmer, some insight into the kinds of things we're looking at. Jerry, if you can move on. So we looked at the business case simulation and some very interesting differences resulted. Again, in the prior research that I talked about, the simulation was looking at strategic agility, innovation, some of the harder competencies. And those are the differences we're seeing here. Fortune 500 CEOs are stronger on judgment. They're stronger on their enterprise perspective than their counterparts at smaller organizations. If we can go to the next slide, Jerry. You're seeing again, strategic agility and financial acumen pop for these folks. The thing that differentiates the CEOs of the larger from smaller companies is stronger performance on strategic agility when they were placed in a simulation that puts them in the role of a global CEO, and stronger financial acumen. So we're seeing the simulation, even among CEO candidates, differentiate those who can take on larger roles in larger organizations from those who take on roles, comparable roles, but in much smaller organizations. If you go to the next slide, Jerry. We're seeing interesting effects from the interview, again, consistent with the research that was done inside PepsiCo regarding promotion. Interview ratings for inspirational and global mindset were much stronger for the Fortune 500. The results for inspirational mirror the results that we showed before about the research inside PepsiCo. We hadn't seen global mindset or global perspective pop earlier, but we're seeing it now. And in retrospect, my post hoc explanation is that makes plenty good sense, right? A Fortune 500 company is a complex global organization, much more important to have a global mindset. Most of the Fortune 1000 companies are not necessarily global in their core competence, right? That's not that they may have vendors outside other organizations. They may sell across organization geographic lines, but their primary focus tends to be domestic, right? So the global mindset is showing a real difference here. Next slide, Jerry. And the final slide is on personality. Interesting results. We're seeing much more emotional balance, much more emotional calm, maturity in the Fortune 500 CEOs than the ones in lower. Again, my post hoc explanation for that is in these bigger, more complex organizations, you're more likely to encounter unexpected and complex challenges. There's probably more volatility. You certainly have an impact on a much larger organization that is harder to manage if it gets away from you. If you're in a very small organization, you make a misstep, you can probably talk to most of the people you need to. That is absolutely not true in a Fortune 500 company. You have to take bigger steps to come back from mistakes or misstatements. And so having stronger emotional balance going into those situations is a real advantage. Interestingly enough, conscientiousness is lower for the Fortune 500 group. This is not something that most IO psychologists would predict, right? The conscientiousness in a CEO sample is actually much smaller. Again, a post hoc explanation is that because these organizations face more volatility, perhaps more uncertainty, more global complexity, right? A strict adherence to delivering on a commitment that no longer makes sense is probably not a very adaptive characteristic to have, right? Doing things the way they've been done, or a strong focus on absolutely delivering on commitments when those commitments no longer make sense because the circumstances have changed, right, is probably not what helps those organizations. That is especially a post hoc explanation, so don't put much weight on that, but make your own assessments based on the data we've shown so far. Jerry, if you can go to the next slide. So in summary, PepsiCo is absolutely a CEO factory, but a CEO is not a CEO. So that the contextual demands of large, complex organizations versus smaller organizations that may be more focused either geographically or in terms of their mission and product lines require slightly different kinds of people. And so being attentive, even in this small, high-performing sample of differences in terms of fundamental characteristics is absolutely required. And that's why we think this multi-method approach has strong predictive impact, even at this very senior level. And Jerry, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bob. There's some interesting results. Even having, working with relatively small samples. And we do have some additional questions that have come up in the chat that I will turn to. One of them is there an individual coaching session / feedback session available to those who take the 360? Any individual support?
So we don't have individual coaching at that 360 level. Again, just the sheer numbers of individuals we put through. What we do from our Global Center of Excellence is we do a report interpretation sessions. So you can come, frankly, the whole team gets there so that we can answer the Q&A for individuals. We walk people through the report and how they can use that report for their development. It's really only at those upper levels, right? Those senior directors and above that they're getting that more white glove, somebody walking you through your data. Lower levels, we do group size orientations. But again, with a cadre of people in the Q&A to answer questions in real time. And if people have questions on interpretation, we answer those in real time. We just ask them to post it anonymously.
Mm-hmm. How do you ensure that the process is fair and unbiased, considering various demographic groups and the global reach of the company?
Yes, so we do several things there. Of course, we have compliance, where we actually have to run an adverse impact every single year. So we do have numerical statistical evidence that they are not showing adverse impact. But also when we put together our, how do you nominate people to go through these processes? We do consider that in those nominations. So we do have that as part of our guidelines. And the other thing I would say, and Bob knows this because he did the research for us, is when we automated that manager to director level lead, we did see an increase in how many individuals that we would consider diverse, right? Just off of the HRIS data alone, going through the process. So it wasn't necessarily a bigger proportion. It was just more individuals in general.
Interesting. Yeah. So this is an interesting question. Someone wants to know the weight that leaders assessments have versus the lead results, the lead assessment in the final potential assessment or evaluation made on an individual.
Not much. We do try to keep this fairly objective. So where I say our objective subjective is actually in our 360, because the manager's 360 ratings do have a heavier weight in that outcome score for the 360 across all the different indicators and grade 5 dimensions. That said, we do look at our assessment results, our more objective assessment results, against the manager's talent call on potential. So there is a little bit of crisscross there, and we don't tell managers that they have to make a change on their potential call on an employee based off of lead data. We really believe in global strategy, where we say this is what we think you should do, but local activation. So if you don't agree, okay, we would say, like, yeah, use the data. But again, when we talk about that, we don't have the context, we don't have the functional expertise, right? A manager is going to much better understand if somebody in R&D has the functional expertise and the technical expertise. We're just talking leadership capabilities. And so we're very open and honest, again, with that. Powerful where it's measured, but we don't promise it is something that it isn't.
Mm-hmm. Do you use a formal HIPO designation? And if so, how do you arrive at that given the approach to the program?
We do. Yeah, we do have a formal HIPO designation. We call it a talent call. And we arrive at that through very much what I just said, global governance, right? Here's the strategy, here's the different pieces of information that a manager should take into account, but the manager makes the call. They're the ones who are there supporting their directs. And so we really do believe that, again, that global strategy, but local activation is a little bit of our secret sauce.
Okay. I know we're very close to time. Bob, I didn't want to leave you out for the questions. One person asks, what does APT stand for?
APT stands for Applied Psychological Techniques, and our doing business as name is APTMetrics, because we focus on metrics.
All right. Well, we are at just about at time now. I want to thank both of you very much for taking the time out for this. This was fascinating, both the description of the program, some of those details, most of those details I was familiar with, but there were a few things in there, Deb, that were new even for me. And Bob, that deep look at the PepsiCo alumni CEOs was really interesting. I see there's still more questions in the chat. We'll go through those and follow up with folks directly for the ones that we didn't get to. I do want to remind people again, as we wrap up, there'll be a very short, just take a few seconds, survey afterwards. Please do take the time to fill that out. It's really helpful for us. And thank you all for attending.